Good afternoon, everyone. We are very excited to welcome you to the first of several sessions we will be having uh, as panelists and with the facilitator, which we'll get into more later, around our wonderful new publication, which you probably can't see, Minding the Obligation Gap in Community Colleges and Beyond. Just wanted to offer you some words of welcome and just remind you that this book is a collaborative effort, which you'll be hearing a lot more about during this afternoon session, as well as the sessions that are to come. But the effort comes about at a critical time where we're looking at the gaps that we see within our institution and connecting them to the broader context and the reality of what we're seeing by the lives lived by our students in the communities where our institutions reside. And so we wanted to do something a little bit more than just have a book launch virtually and or in face or book talks, but we wanted to engage in an opportunity for us to have a dialogue with our colleagues, dialogue with other practitioners, and to be able to share. And so this is why we've created this series. And so the way the series is sequenced is that each one of the co-authors will be featured on each series. So you'll get a chance to engage that person a little bit more in depth, as well as get a in-depth understanding of the contents of the book. I want to let you know that you do not have to own the book or have access to the book to be able to follow along and know what we're talking about and understand what we're talking about. The book is available in electronic format at Peter Lane and also at Amazon.com. And you can go to mindingtheobligationgap.com and click on the link that says buy, and it'll take you to those two pages. As far as receiving it in paperback form, we're still working with the publisher on being able to make that accessible. We had some pre-orders available on Amazon, and they sold out, which is a good thing for us as far as being able to have our book out of stock, but it's not a good thing for us because it's in high demand. And so you will have the ability to get it electronically today, but hopefully in the next upcoming week, you will get an update on when it will be available in paperback and hardback form. So I want you to follow along with us today. Those who are using social media, we are strongly encouraging that you use the hashtag that you see at the bottom of the slide, which is obligation gap. And so if you're going to live tweet or post things on Instagram or use your Snap or whatever social media platform that you're using, Facebook, we're asking that we communicate using hashtag obligation gap. So without any further ado, Dr. Frank Harris III is a professor of post-secondary education and co-director of the Community College Equity Assessment Lab, or CEAL, at San Diego State University. He is best known for his expertise in racial inequity in post-secondary education and has made important contributions to knowledge about college student development and the social construction of gender and race in college contexts. His work prioritizes populations that have been historically underrepresented and underserved in education. Dr. Harris's scholarship has been published in leading journals for higher education and student affairs research and practice. He has also delivered more than 1,000 academic and professional presentations throughout his career. His commentary has been sought by several high-profile media outlets, including CNN, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and the Chronicle of Higher Education, to name a few. Harris is also regularly consulted by colleges and universities across the country for his expertise on equity, student success, and institutional transformation. Harris earned his bachelor's degree in communication studies at Loyola Marymount University, a master's degree in speech communications from California State University Northridge, and a doctorate in higher education from the Rogier School of Education at the University of Southern California. More importantly, I have had the pleasure throughout my career to work side by side with Dr. Harris. And the most important thing is not just his academic credentials, not just his publications in web-based and book-based, but also his undying and unapologetic commitment to the work of equity and seeing it through. And it shines through everything that he publishes, every talk that he gives, and every time he consults with a client. And so being able to work in the field with someone who has a social justice commitment is a breath of fresh air. And it also reminds us all that we're not in this work alone, and we have committed warriors along our side. So without any further ado, I introduce to you all our host, Dr. Frank Harris III.
Thank you, Lasana, for the warm and wonderful introduction. I want to say good afternoon to everyone who's joining us on today's webinar. First and foremost, I want to say that I hope everyone is doing well. I hope everyone's loved ones are doing well in light of many of the recent events that have taken place in our country. And second, of course, I want to thank the authors for inviting me to moderate this webinar. We're at a critical time in our world's history. We're fighting two global pandemics, the first of which is COVID-19, which has killed 408,000 people, shut down the essential institutions we rely on every day, like our schools and churches, and it's cost us more than 30 million jobs in the United States. The second pandemic is anti-Blackness. But unlike COVID-19, which is a relatively new pandemic, anti-Blackness has been around for centuries. And while some folks have become awakened to anti-Blackness in light of the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, and by Central Park Amy, the woman who flagrantly and falsely accused a Black man of attacking her because he asked her to obey the law by leashing her dog, many of us, particularly those who are Black, can attest that anti-Blackness is a crippling disease that has impacted our lives and our families' lives for generations. And so the question becomes, what does the intersection of these two global pandemics, anti-Blackness and COVID-19, charge us to do as educators? How should it change the way we teach, lead, and serve students? And in response, I offer three reasons. First, the pandemic reminds us about the urgent need to be race conscious in everything that we do as educators. We need to not only recognize the ways in which education in the US is fundamentally designed to edify and celebrate white supremacy, the ways in which curricula are designed and delivered, and the practices that are used to inform and validate hiring decisions, and the ways in which funding is allocated. They are not intended to be in the best interest of minoritized students. And again, this is not by accident, it's by design. Second, we also need to assume personal and institutional responsibility for minoritized students' success. When the students we teach and serve are not successful, we need to see this not as an indication of the students underperforming, but rather as an indication of our underperforming and the institutions failing to meet their needs. And third, we need to care about them. And not just care in a casual sense, but caring to the point where we have a vested interest in their lives, being genuinely concerned about their well-being, and being personally invested in their success. Collectively, being race conscious, assuming personal and institutional responsibility for student success, and authentically caring about students are what Estella Ben-Simon describes as equity-mindedness. And perhaps now more than ever, we need equity-minded educators if we expect education to be the great equalizer that it has the potential to be, and to change the life opportunities for generations to come. A second question also emerges from the intersection of COVID-19 and anti-Blackness. That is, as a person who does not come from a minoritized background, why should I care about this? In response to this question, I have this to say. These pandemics have a toxic influence on all of us, not just Black communities, but everyone. And I think it's somewhat easy to adopt this perspective when it comes to COVID-19, but we need to think about racism in the same way. It does not matter if I'm healthy, but if my neighbor is unhealthy, then I am also at risk of suffering the consequences of this pandemic. And just like COVID-19, racism threatens our health, safety, ability to cope, and well-being. And so this brings us to minding the obligation gap in community colleges and beyond. This is an important book that comes to us at a critically important time. Quoting Dr. Taylor Mendoza on page 36 of the book, by definition, the obligation gap calls out the institution, not the student, to be the prime agent of change. This gap necessitates acts of genuine care and calls for civic consciousness predicated on justice with the intention to inspire epistemological disruption and a reconstruction of educational structures. It is written by 5 equity-minded community college educators with a proven track record of success in changing education and life outcomes for minoritized students, but also challenging institutions to be better and to do better. What I really appreciate about this book is the integration of critical theoretical perspectives, equity-minded practices, and the personal narratives that come from the author's journeys to and through education, which is perhaps my favorite part of the book. But this is not just a book. It's a tool for building our capacity to dismantle educational apartheid. And it also boldly critiques bedrock principles in higher education, like shared governance. It calls for a complete re-envisioning of the ways in which community colleges do business. The book has 7 chapters, each of which are written individually by one of the 5 authors. Each chapter concludes with a set of further considerations and discussion questions, which makes it suitable for course adoption, particularly for those of you who are teaching graduate courses in equity and diversity. In fact, I plan to assign it as required reading for my doctoral class in the Community College Leadership Program at San Diego State University this summer. On this webinar, you will get the opportunity to do 4 things. First, you'll hear from the authors as they discuss key learnings from their chapters and take you behind the scenes to share the theories and experiences that inform their writings. Second, you'll get the opportunity to partake in some collaboratively designed learning activities that will challenge your perspectives on the intersection of institutional racism, opportunity, and obligation. And third, you'll get to dialogue with the authors. So please jot down thoughts, questions, and reflections that come to mind as you will have the opportunity to share them during the webinar. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, you'll learn how you can buy the book. And so again, thank you for joining us on this webinar. We look forward to engaging you throughout. For those of you who are active on social media, we invite you to share your thoughts and reflections using the hashtag on the bottom right of each slide, hashtag obligation gap. And with that, I'll turn the discussion over to Dr. Jeremiah Sims and Dr. Jennifer Taylor Mendoza, who will discuss what inspired their vision for minding the obligation gap.
Now I'm unmuted. Thank you, Dr. Harris. That's why Frank Harris is Frank Harris. That was amazing. I'm inspired after hearing that opening word. And so, so this book, so I wrote a book in 2018, and the process wasn't as arduous as I thought it was. I'm just being completely transparent because it was based on my dissertation. And so I had a good time and it didn't kill me. And so I got the idea to write another book that was community college specific. So what initially impelled me to begin to talk about this work is that the reality is even if you want to teach 4- and 5-year-olds in the K-12 system, you're required to take some coursework on teaching and learning, right? i.e. pedagogy. But that is not the case by and large at the community college level. At the community college level, if you have a master's degree in statistics and you get hired, then you can teach statistics. But absent coursework on kind of metacognitive coursework on teaching and learning, sometimes you run into some risks. And I've had experiences with faculty members who've been completely transparent, and I appreciate their candor. But there was someone who came to speak to me about his belief, and he was ashamed of this belief, but his belief was that women were just not well suited to excel in his course. This was a course in the hard sciences. And so what was happening, because he was not yet in a position to think reflectively and reflexively about what he was saying, that the way that he taught disenfranchised women in his class, so they did poorly in his class, but them doing poorly in his class fed his implicit bias. So there was this sinister cycle where he thought they wouldn't do well and they didn't do well because he wasn't responding to their needs in the same way that he was with males. And so I felt like, and still feel like, one of the biggest issues facing community colleges with regard to pedagogical concerns is the absence of required coursework on teaching and learning. So initially what I wanted to do was write a book about what I termed at that time the pedagogy gap at community college. Jennifer, who hired me at the College of San Mateo, was my supervisor. I went to speak to her about that. And she said, I've been thinking as well. And she said, there's something that I want to address, and it's called the obligation gap. So Jennifer, you can jump in.
Thank you. And so first of all, good afternoon, everyone. I feel truly inspired as of this moment. My name is Dr. Jennifer Taylor Mendoza, and I'm the Vice President of Instruction at Skyline College. And this has been such an enjoyable process, but very, very liberating as well. So as Jeremiah already alluded to, when I was the Dean of Academic Support and Learning Technologies at the College of San Mateo, I had the opportunity to support an amazing program called Project Change under the leadership of Katie Bliss. And the program serves both formerly incarcerated and currently incarcerated youth. And I remember one time being at a strategic planning meeting, and really just with listening to faculty and classified professional and administrators, you know, not only just their concerns about moving forward, but some of the anxiety and the fear around how do we begin to really meet the needs of, you know, incarcerated youth. And I sat there as I was listening, as we all do in these meetings, right? We talk, and we try to strategize ways, but and then at times we blame the students, and that maybe not intentionally, but I started to think about, you know, the students aren't the problem. The problem is us.
Yeah.
And that was clear. It was clear in that room. And I remember sharing that, you know, with Jeremiah Sims and just talking to him about, you know, the concept behind the obligation gap really is to put the onus on us to put into place the systems of liberation. You know, intentional disruption combined with support to bring really about transformational change. You know, we have the achievement gap, we have the opportunity gap, but that falls on the student to be responsible. Yeah. But where's the obligation of the institution, you know, to really make sure that our systems are equitable to ensure that they succeed. And so when we had this conversation, it was just a natural that we wanted to look to colleagues to begin to really share and tell the story. Another couple of things I want to also say is that in the book, in my acknowledgement, I acknowledge the communities and the familias and the tribes that embrace the students who feel disenfranchised. And I want those individuals to know that there are individuals that understand what it means to be responsible for students that, you know, look like me. And so I want to also give my respects to those who have been in the struggle, who constantly are resilient in making sure that they're providing the support and doing all they can for the children that they love. One other thing is important too. When I was going through my dissertation research, I remember my chair telling me to, you know, don't just be a practitioner, you know, don't just, you know, think about, you know, be a theorist, but, you know, share the story. And I think often in community college, we don't share the story, so people tell the story for us. And so I want to encourage you authors out there, or those who really understand the community college system and how we're serving students, to speak up. And so we can continue to not have other agencies and organizations tell our story, but allow the folks who are actually the practitioners in the field doing that. So that's what this book is to me, just this beautiful collaboration. Thank you.
And I want to take the opportunity, thank you for that, Dr. Taylor Mendoza, to apologize profusely. So I was behind the scenes trying to put this together, and I was not able to secure closed captioning for accessibility, and I apologize for that. Moving forward, that's going to be a priority. So it's not available on this webinar, and I'm sorry. It will be recorded, and I'll see if I can possibly get it transcribed later, but as of right now, there's no closed captioning, so I apologize for that. All right, so anytime I've been blessed to be in a position to work in trainings and workshops, both with other people and individually training people, and I like to start with some presuppositions. And so the presuppositions that are going to kind of undergird this webinar are as follows. First, the obligation gap is real. So Dr. Taylor Mendoza spoke to spoke to this earlier, right? So we do celebrate, and we are proponents of and advocates for students who have demonstrated resiliency in their educational journeys. At the same time, we need to figure out why they need to be resilient in the first place, right? Black and brown students overwhelmingly are congratulated and ballyhooed because of their ability to rise above and to rise up when they've been knocked down. But we got to stop knocking them down, right? Because each time they get up, there's a victory there, but each time they have to get up and face a new obstacle, there's potential for trauma to be inscribed into their being. And so we need to make sure that we understand that we have an obligation to reduce the amount of resilience they have to demonstrate in order to be successful, in order to reach their fullest potential. Secondarily, well, not secondarily, we'll just go second. The obligation gap is a byproduct of white supremacy and racialized capitalism. So racialized capitalism is what we have. We have a form of perverse capitalism in this country, and capital is accrued on the backs of Black and brown people, therefore making it racialized capitalism. White supremacy is the belief that everything white is right. That's shorthand. Thirdly, community colleges are uniquely positioned to be disruptive technologies. And so I'm sure we have a number of faculty folks on here and people who have taught before. And normally the word disruptive, it carries negative connotations. But at the College of San Mateo, we're on the, I don't know if we're fully in it geographically, but at the very least, we're on the doorstep of Silicon Valley. And in Silicon Valley, disruption is good. Everybody's after the biggest disruption, the greatest disruption, because what a disruptive technology does is it causes folks committed to a certain type of work to reassess the way that they do their work. Otherwise, they run the risk of becoming obsolete. And so I would argue at community colleges, because by and large, we've tried to replicate the work that four-year colleges do, even though we don't have the same strictures and arguably the same goals, we've created a kind of homeostasis wherein we just unproblematically replicate inequities for the students who are most educationally maligned. And so one of the main tenets of this book is that community colleges are uniquely positioned to function as disruptive technologies. We're open access, right? We do things differently, and we can do things differently so that we begin to identify and deconstruct and hopefully eradicate the macro-structural inequity that negatively impacts poor, ethno-racially minoritized students of color. Fourthly, disruption is necessary to identify and to close the obligation gap. Closing the obligation gap will benefit poor, ethno-racially minoritized students of color and committed educators. If we consider ourselves to be committed educators, we must be willing to function as advocates for justice-centered disruption. So those are the presuppositions that undergird this 5-part webinar series. And so this is our first activity. And so what I felt is the easiest to do is for people to just post their order in a chat. So you see there are 4 boxes here. What these boxes represent is a kind of linear relationship. And so the 4 terms that you can choose from for this activity are racism, white supremacy, race, and capitalism. And so what I want you to do in the chat box, if you are so inclined, is to just put the order these things originated in. And then let's just see it in the chat box. I want to hear from folks. Yeah, somebody also put numbers, so that might be even faster. Huh. This is awesome. So we are not going to offer any answers right now. We're just going to let you all process. And we'll return to this at a later point. But keep going. I want to see it. And we'll just let people go for a minute, maybe 30 more seconds. This is awesome. Thank you all for participating. Actually, I will speak to this a little bit before we transition. So I'm a firm believer that neither race nor white supremacy or even racism are what started this, but it's actually the perverse form of capitalism that this country's economy is predicated on. And I'll just leave it at that before we go to activity 2. So for activity 2, I'll just start talking through it now. You're going to see a series of images, and the images are going to go by fairly quickly. If they have more words, then you have perhaps 10 seconds. But they're going to go by fairly quickly, and so there'll be instructions for each set of pictures. And let me be more clear about that. So the first picture will say you have a 1-word response. Until you see a picture that says you have 2 words, then you stick with 1 word. And so again, you're going to type your words into the chat box. So you see the directions there. So I'll give more time when there are multiple pictures or if there's text that needs to be read. And we just want your immediate visceral reactions. So Jeremy, would you please go to the next slide? So just 1 word. All right, Jeremy, can you go to the next slide, please? All right, let's go. Next slide. Give you a little more time on this one. There are people here who are participating in the George Floyd Challenge. Next, Jeremy. So now you can type 2 words. Next, Jeremy. Next slide, please. Next. Next. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next. 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 Next slide, please. Next. Next. Next slide. Next slide, please. Next. Next slide, Jeremy. Next slide. Next slide. So I want to talk about this definition. Anti-Blackness is the progeny of white supremacy and racialized capitalism. Anti-Blackness is simultaneously macrostructural and commonsensical disregard for the concerns, cares, joys, freedoms, bodies, and very lives of Black people. That's how we're defining anti-Blackness here. Next slide. I think this is the last slide. And that's it for activity 2.
Thank you.
Oh, go ahead.
Yep.
Sorry. Go ahead,
Yeah.
Dr. Harris.
No, I was just, wanted to thank you for leading us through that important activity. I know it was difficult for all of us. And what I want to do now is transition to the discussion about the book. And going to invite each author to spend a couple minutes describing their chapters. We're supposed to start with the preface and introduction. So, Dr. Sims, I don't know if you want us to maybe go to chapter 2 first, and then we'll come back to you. Excuse me, chapter 1 first, and then we'll come back to you if you want to do it that way.
I'm okay, Doc. I can go.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you for that option.
Yeah.
So the point of the activity, we're not going to spend too much time on it, but I just want to reflect because I don't want to leave you all hanging. But the point of the activity, if you aren't utterly disgusted by some of the things that you saw there, then you have to reposition your heart if you ever hope to close the obligation gap and any of the concomitant gaps. That has to be repulsive to you. The things that you've seen, if you truly hope to work in solidarity, to work alongside the students who have been targeted and forcefully marginalized in this country. It has to be sickening. And so I just want to encourage you all to go deep, because if you really want to do the work, if you really want to help these students, then there's no way that you can pass over that type of imagery and just keep it moving. And so I'll talk about the preface. The preface of this book, so I was a community college student. I'm from Richmond, California. I was born in Oakland. I was raised in Richmond, California. I was not on the periphery of what was going on in Richmond, California. I was with the stuff, is a saying that we use, except the word is not stuff. And so it took a long time for me to realize that school was a viable option for me, because I had internalized the statistic that was prevalent during my time in high school, which was growing up where I grew up in the mid-90s. When I was in high school, Richmond had the highest murder rate per capita in the whole of the United States. And so I was truly convinced that my life would not go past the age of 21. And so I had no aspirations for anything beyond 21. I figured once I got to 21, maybe I'll start to plan my future. And so I went to community college because I grew up in Section 8 housing, and part of the requirement for Section 8 low-income housing was that if I was 18 and I was still in that home, I needed to sign up for 12 units of coursework every semester. I didn't have to complete the units, but I just needed to sign up for it. I just needed to show the printout that I'd signed up to the housing authority, which I did semester after semester, but I never completed any semesters. So I had a 1.1 GPA. Eventually, I was dismissed from Contra Costa College, and that was it for me. And so after some time, I went back to school with some renewed vigor, because I became intimately interested in the plight of Black and brown males, specifically that I grew up around, that I cared for. I grew up in a housing complex where it only allowed for single mothers to be there. So there were a bunch of young men I was like an older brother to, and their lives weren't going the way that we would hope. And I wanted to do something about it. So I went back to school. Also, there was a young woman that I was interested in at the time, and her father said that if I want to marry her, I have to get a college degree. Not only that, I had to go to Berkeley. And so I went back to school, and boy, oh boy, did I go to Berkeley. So anyway, the endless loop of my misguided community college pathway speaks to that experience. Chapter 1, Naming the Obligation Gap, talks about disruption, how disruption can be used as a positive tool, because we want to disrupt the inequity, we want to disrupt the anti-Blackness, we want to disrupt the racism, we want to disrupt the homophobia and all the other isms that negatively impact the marginalized or the marginalized. So with that, I will pass it on to Dr. Jennifer Taylor Mendoza.
Thank you, Dr. Sims. And just as always, I appreciate you. I appreciate your heart and your honesty, and for taking us through that exercise. I'm going to actually get the opportunity to speak to my chapter in more in depth. I will say that it was really important that this chapter, it has a is theoretically grounded and has a strong foundation of just the history of the junior college system, later renamed, as the community college. I focus on really 3 main components of the obligation gap, and Dr. Harris already stated them, which was how do institutions enact genuine care, civic consciousness, and then also brave leadership. So I think I'll stop there. I look forward to going more in depth with all of you in a few moments. So I'm going to turn it over to Lasana to discuss chapter 3 and the programming gap.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Lasana Hotep. I serve as the Executive Director of the Equity Institute at Skyline College, and had the wonderful pleasure of contributing chapter 3, which is Mining the Programming Gap. This chapter came about as more of a case study, right? At Skyline College, I was part of a team that developed something called the Equity Training Series. And I will unpack all of these things in my session next Thursday. But the Equity Training Series serves as a case study for those who are on the student services side of the house in how to implement programming and implement equity-minded practices that are rooted in a particular framework. Traditional diversity and inclusion frameworks have not necessarily gotten us to where we are able to close these gaps. And it's a variety of reasons behind that, and I explore those. I also center the fact that our work is anti-sexist, anti-racist, and in solidarity with our queer communities. And from those bases is how we move forward with our work. The chapter includes scholarship, the literature, the theories that we developed it on, but most importantly, for those who are interested in having a culture shift or an impact in the climate of their institution, the prerequisites, the things that need to be in place organizationally for your programming to have a place to land. A lot of us think that we can just host a seminar, a symposia, a speaker, or train one particular confined aspect of our campus, or say the equity diversity people will take care of it. None of those assumptions are valid. And so what my chapter does is it provides a framework, it provides a real live example of how to impact culture, and it involves, most importantly, what has to be in place as the prerequisites to set the tone for our institutions to be able to be equity advancing. And so that's what my chapter is about, and I detail that in our next talk on next Thursday.
I was muted. I can pick it up with Mining the Pedagogy Gaps. I already spoke to this earlier. Again, shameless plug. I wrote a book in 2018. It's called Revolutionary STEM Education, Critical Reality Pedagogy and Social Justice in STEM for Black Males. And so that book, in that book, I unearthed the term and kind of political educational paradigm called critical reality pedagogy that builds on the work of folks like Freire and Giraud, and also Professor Christopher Emdin, who coined the term reality pedagogy. So critical reality pedagogy is taken up in great detail in this chapter, because what I'm arguing for is a kind of pedagogy that not only, so multicultural education was huge, and it was an advancement in social justice type work. Multicultural education is still valid today. However, I felt that multicultural education was, the way that it was being instituted, was missing the activist component. So critical reality pedagogy is like thinking about critical thinking. The metaphor for critical thinking is to think outside the box. Critical reality pedagogy positions students to not only think outside the box, but to think outside the box, turn around and look at the box's positionality, figure out if the box should remain a box, and if so, how it should be deconstructed and later reconstructed so that it's commensurate with social justice. And so this chapter takes up critical reality pedagogy and argues for a need for a different type of educational paradigm with regard to community college education. And with that, I will open it up for Dr. Tabitha Conaway to speak to chapter 5.
Hello all, I'm Dr. Tabitha Conaway. I'm the Interim Dean of Enrollment Services and Support Programs at the College of San Mateo. Chapter 5, Enacting Educational Equity. is a case study based off of a long-term professional development training series that Dr. Sims and I co-taught and co-created. For me, coming into the community college as an educator, rather late in my educational career, I've been a K-12 teacher for a little over a decade, working in inner cities, starting my teaching career in Inglewood at Century Charter Community School. So if any Bears are here, go Bears. When I started teaching in community college and being a staff person as well, what I noticed is that what we weren't talking about is our practices. How are our practices aligned with what we believe our students can achieve? And how do we implement these things? And so what the training series is, really briefly, is it's a place where faculty and staff can come together and not only analyze our practices, but also understand the historical context and theory behind how we should implement our practices. As a historian by training, it's very important to me that we understand the historical basis for racism. When Dr. Sims started the activity, having us try to place what came first in this chicken and egg scenario around white supremacy and capitalism and racism, that's where we have to start. And as educators, both staff and faculty, right? Because we're all educators, we are all here for our practices to help instill in our students the ability to achieve. We need to be obligated to analyze our own practices. We have educators in community college who want to do this work, but do not have the training, do not have the support. And so this long-term PD project was designed to help with that, was designed to be a place where we come together, where we collectively discuss critical race theory, where we collectively discuss capitalism and how that plays a role, racialized capitalism and how that plays a role in today's society. What does structural racism look like? And how can we then examine our own practices critically and help make those changes in our institution as well as our places that we are interacting with students. So I will pass it along to Jeremy Wallace.
Thank you, Tabitha. Hi, y'all. Thank you for coming to this webinar. I'm really humbled by the number of people that have signed up, and I'm really happy that we're able to have this conversation today. My name is Jeremy Wallace. I'm an associate professor of English at the College of San Mateo. I'm also the academic senate president for the San Mateo Community College District. Prior to that, I was the academic senate president for the College of San Mateo Academic Senate. And I'm also a longtime member of the CSM Umoja community. My chapters are both chapters 6 and 7. And in those chapters, I really focus on 3 strands. The first one is I go through a history of shared governance in the United States higher education system. I talk about how critical race theory can help us start to identify, critique, and dismantle institutionalized racism and other forms of hatred under faculty purview. And I talk about how to promote educational equity and achieve social justice within the shared governance framework. I'm going to be talking about these 3 strands in a lot more detail on July 8th during the webinar on shared governance. But just kind of give you a little kind of taste of what we'll be talking about. So as far as the history of governance goes, I focus on the history of shared governance and its basis in faculty expertise, which dates back to some of the first colleges in this country, indeed even back to some of the earliest colleges in Europe. I'll be focusing specifically on the academic senates and their purview over academic and professional matters. And I'm going to look specifically at the California Community College system as a case study in shared governance, because it's what I know best. I know many, many, many of you are also employees in the California Community College system. The second piece is I want to look at equity and social justice in shared governance. And so I look at shared governance through a critical race lens. Academic senates, you know, because they are centuries old, or sorry, shared governance is centuries old. Academic senates probably not about a century old. But they operate within a framework that where they create policies, they create procedures, they create other structures in the colleges, all right? And these policies, procedures, and other structures are, of course, vulnerable to promoting institutionalized racism and other forms of oppression. I think it's important to acknowledge that academic senates have both the power to maintain the status quo by doing nothing, but we also have the power to change, all right, to disrupt, as my colleagues argue, right? It's this latter point that I focus on throughout my chapters, right? That we have the power to change, the power to disrupt. My mentor, James Carranzo, has always told me that academic senates have a noble purpose, all right? And with this in mind, that I argue that faculty leaders have the responsibility, indeed the obligation, to undo oppressive structures and to replace them with ones that are equitable, that empower our minoritized students, and that liberates all our students. All right. And then in chapter 7, the third kind of strand is, okay, like we've gone over the history of shared governance. We've looked at it through this critical race lens. Like, what do we do now? All right. So chapter 7 focuses almost exclusively on practices that faculty can leverage within their purview over academic matters that they can use to promote educational equity and achieve social justice. I outline a framework of equity-minded leadership that I believe will help faculty leaders engage in these critical and brave conversations about race, racism, white supremacy, and justice. And I share some practical strategies for senates to use in making positive changes in the policies, procedures, and other structures under their purview. So I look forward to chatting about that more on July 8th, and I'm going to pass it now to Jeremiah.
And so in closing, the epilogue is just a call to action. We got to stop. We have to stop talking so much. It's good to create and carve out spaces for brave conversations, but I feel like sometimes we spend a lot of time carving out spaces for brave conversations, and then we converse, and then we converse some more. So we need to figure out what it is that we can do to actually enact educational equity for the students who have been educationally maligned. And that's not happenstantial, it's purposeful. And once you understand that to be the case, there's work that can be done and work that must be done in order to change the environment. And so the epilogue is speaking to that. And I just wanted to mention, Dr. Harris spoke to this earlier, each of these chapters has an end of chapter review and questions for discussion. And so each of these chapters are designed to function as a kind of professional development training. In the aggregate, the book works, but each individual chapter can function that way as well. So I want to encourage folks, once the book is freely available, maybe I shouldn't say free, readily available, to take a look at and make sure that some of the questions went out. Some of y'all actually turned in homework, so I appreciate that. The homework is not assigned, it's purely optional. I know everybody's busy. So if you want to do it and you want to send it back, that's great. If not, it's all on you. But anyway, I just wanted to point that aspect of the book out as we move forward. And so with that, that's the overview of the book.
And I just wanted to say before we hand it over to Frank Harris, is that the underlying thing along with the presuppositions is that we have to question our assumptions.
Yep.
And one of the biggest challenges that we're having is the questioning of our assumptions. We think because we have good intent, that intent actually is what's important, when impact is what's important. And so let me give you an example of what I mean by questioning our assumptions, just so you can have an idea, and then we'll move forward. A lot of people think that we have racial animus in our schools and in our climates and in our society because people don't know each other. They're not familiar with each other. They don't spend enough time with each other. They need to get together and have more intercultural and multicultural gatherings. And the argument is that the reason why we have racial animus is because we don't know each other. But we also have something in society called sexism. The sexism exists because men aren't in proximity to women. We're not in proximity of our mothers, our partners, our colleagues. So the assumption that the reason why we have this animus is about proximity. But in reality, that's not why we have animus. We have animus because narratives have been created to rationalize exploitation. So if you're doing your work in equity and you haven't interrogated the fact that equity deals with social injustice, and equity deals with the fact that people have been exploited based on false narratives about their group, then you're going to have a totally different outcome and a totally different type of experience you're going to create if you just think it's about people coming together that are different. People coming together that are different to end exploitation, right? And so that's what we mean by questioning assumptions. So Frank Harris, bring us home.
Thank you, Lasana. I do apologize. My Wi-Fi dropped at home, so I had to rejoin on my phone. But at this time, what I'm going to do is
Right now, you're talking like a robot. I might have to step in. Give me a second.
It's like the sloths of Zootopia at the DMV.
Give me 1 second.
You tell I got a lot of young kids.
As I'll say, you got kids.
Yeah, you do too.
I do. Yeah, I know exactly.
Yeah,
I got that joke.
You've seen Zootopia.
I got that joke.
So
We're on Frozen trip right now, though.
And I would like to.
Well, Dr. Harris is frozen, so.
So I'm going to read Dr. Taylor Mendoza's bio and bring her on while we work with Dr. Harris's technological challenges. Dr. Jennifer Taylor Mendoza is the Vice President of Instruction at Skyline College, and my proud colleague, an educator with over 20 years of higher education experience, 18 years in community college system as a classified professional, tenured faculty leader, director, dean, and vice president. She is continually inspired by the brilliance, power, and endless potential of community college students. Through collective action, she works with faculty, classified professionals, students, and administrators to lead initiatives, guided pathways, professional development, online learning, workforce partnerships, global learning, and dual enrollment pathways. Her work integrates student services and instruction, dismantling structural inequities to create programs responsive to local economic and social needs. Dr. Taylor Mendoza is a member of the Board of Directors, Human Investment Project, HIP Housing. She is an Aspen Presidential Fellow. Currently, she is an elected executive board member for the state's chief instructional officers and serving as the CIO representative to the state chancellor's Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Work Group. A proud alumna of El Camino College, she holds a BA in psychology from Cal State University, Los Angeles, an MS in counseling in California State University, Northridge, and a PhD in education from the Claremont Graduate University. I have had the honor to work with Dr. Taylor Mendoza since I first came to the San Mateo Community College District when she was at San Mateo Community College and I was at Skyline. And then eventually she made her way over from being dean of ASLT to coming over to VPI. And we've been able to share a table at President's Cabinet in forging a way forward for our students and for our community at large. And I'm really, really appreciative and have a lot of gratitude for being able to work with Dr. Jennifer Taylor Mendoza.
Thank you, Lasana. Thank you so much for that introduction. It's so hard for me to speak after that. You know me and I know you. Thank you so much for being not only just a great colleague in this work, but also a brother. So thank you so much. I have to give a shout out to Tabitha since she mentioned Inglewood. I'm from those of you who know me, I'm from Southern California and I was born in Inglewood. And so I wanted to just give a shout out for Inglewood. And I also, like Lasana said, went to El Camino College where my start began. And I started the chapter by giving a personal reflection by the person who definitely is responsible for changing my life and changing the lives of my children and generations, of course, to come, Kenneth Key from El Camino, if he's on this call. So I want to start off, next slide, Jeremy. Thank you. I want to start off with an activity, KWL plus action. And so in this section, I discuss the central role of leadership. And I use this activity, it's a reflection activity, and it's used to help you sort of keep track of your thoughts. You know, with the images, there's so many things happening and how we're feeling right now. It's a simple tool that I would like to start us off with today. So to get us started, I would like to So KWO stands for what you know. W is what you want to know, what you've learned, and then after what you've learned, how you're going to enact that. And so I want us to take about 2 minutes to just, and you can respond in the chat box, but I want you to take a couple minutes just to talk about what do you think you know about leadership and our obligation to serve students, leadership and really just enacting the obligation gap. So let's take about 2 minutes just to sort of think about that.
And feel free to just drop that in the chat box if you want to put in the chat and engage in the activity.
Mm. Yeah. Okay. And then now I want you to take just a couple minutes to talk about what you want to know about leadership and our obligation to serve. So take a couple minutes now to talk about what you want to know about leadership and the obligation gap in regards to student success. Yeah, how to put into action. This is awesome. Thank you. Keep going. Well intended, but hurts our students. Okay. Okay. Thank you. It's so great. It's so awesome to see the chat box. I'm just like zoned into it. So we're going to hold off on the learned in action. But what I ask for you today, at the end of today's webinar, please take some time to reflect on what you've learned. And plus, maybe, commit definitely to at least one action that you might like to take and share that with a colleague. And I love that. Love is the foundation of teaching and leadership, what to know, how to get past egos. I absolutely love that. And so I love this exercise because it really just puts us in a place of beginning to sort of reflect and really understand our feelings and thoughts. And for this work to happen, we need to have moments of intentional reflection. So we'll talk about that. Okay, next slide, please. So what I'm going to do is really begin to go over the historical context, where we've been, talk a little bit about organizational inertia, what we're up against, And then the noble purpose, you know, epistemological disruption. And you're going to keep hearing this term disruption throughout the entire Summer Institute. So next slide. So the system is designed perfectly. The system is designed perfectly, right? So why do I say that, right? So Britton Carabell, if anyone knows, they've done a lot of research around the beginnings of the junior colleges. And they said their system was not envisioned as one of educational reform and democracy. Instead, it furthered class and racial divide to elevate white intellectual. So why further the racial divide? So let's just talk a little bit about what was happening at the time and what were the competing interests. So the junior colleges have their roots dated back to the Morrill Acts of 1862 and 1890. And I'm not a historian, but I think if you ever want to know just about all the land grants and how colleges came about, it's really important to do some research on the Morrill Acts of 1862 and 1890 in particular, and how historically Black colleges were established. And so the Morrill Act really expanded access into higher education. It opened opportunity to, at that time, thousands of farmers and working people who were previously excluded from higher education. And so the first Morrill Act really was to establish sort of agricultural vocational programs and establish colleges that could work with that. But at the same time, it was also dealing with the fact that there were a lot of farmers and other folks who were excluded from higher education. At the same time, you know, we had the educational intellectuals of the Ivy Leagues and the leaders and government leaders also concerned about meeting the workforce needs. You know, we have veterans returning from war, we have industrialization, and the need for semi-skilled labor for the underclass. And then this sort of idealized notion that America was this land of opportunity, right? And so, and how does everyone benefit from this land of opportunity, and how is everyone going to be able to overcome their situation through education? At the same time, there was a huge conflict because education was only meant for the elite, white males in particular, obviously. It wasn't a meritocracy, but a weeding out process. So that's really important when you think about the foundations of the junior colleges and how they came about, in particular being vocational schools. At the same time, we have this sort of what I call the purification of education, right? The established two tiers where you have vocational lower division while maintaining the academic purity in upper division research institution. And so you had sort of this divide, right, where you have the Harvards and the Yales and these Ivy Leagues where they were really focused on academic research in the upper echelon and making sure that those individuals who would pursue that education were from the elite class. And then as well as you had this concern about those individuals who needed to have vocational training, and how do you begin to deal with the rest of society who are not social elite? And so you see this sort of divide in these two educational systems happening, right? You have this longstanding academic research where you're sending folks through, but then you also have this need to create sort of this vocational track, right? And the divide in academic research and intellectual pursuit was reserved for the social elite, AKA white upper class males. Another sort of, conflating factor was that most of the founding fathers were eugenicists, you know. A lot of them believed in the superior genetic traits and sort of inferior genetic traits at the same time. And you can guess who owned which traits, you know. They did not look like me, the superior genetic trait, right? So, and then the founding fathers, they were major players. So you had folks like Richard Henry Jesse, who was the president of the University of Missouri. You had William Rainey Harper, which was the president of the University of Chicago. David Starr Jordan, who was the president of Stanford University. Henry Philip Tapan, who was the president of the University of Michigan. You had William Watts Folwell, who was the president of the University of Minnesota, and Alexis Lang, who was the dean of the University of California, Berkeley. Sorry, Jeremiah, I know you went to Cal, but I just wanted to give a shout out to that. So you have these founding fathers who really began to design the junior college system, later to be renamed the community college, who were eugenists and also had eugenic beliefs, and they framed policy and legislation in the development of our system. So it leaves one to wonder, why is it this way? And more importantly, and this is really the most important, how do we ultimately rethink the systems or outthink the systems to really to be the systems needed to support students? So I go into that in more depth, and then obviously you can, I encourage you to do your own research, because we see a lot of eugenic practices even through our system. Testing is a huge major one of them. So I think it was important. I'm looking at the chat boxes, and you're looking at Francis Galton, it's important to know that the founding fathers and those theories were very much German, centric and Eurocentric in that. Next slide, please. Another thing that is important that I'd speak to is that what I'm calling organizational inertia, right? Inertia is the natural barrier to implementing strategic and high impact organizational change, because it does not allow for new perspectives to penetrate the structure. So organizational inertia has to do with the weight of the status quo. Why does it take so long for change to occur in our organization, right? Why is it that we continuously we do the same thing over and over and over again, and then we're so resistant to change? Why are we so comfortable? The tension of maintaining the college's mission, but at what expense, right? When we rely on antiquated policies or processes, which may be resistant to progress. So we have to find a way to disrupt the usual cycle to generate new ideas. And we can do this in a few ways. Next slide. So, the reconstruction of the community college is what I think is the most essential, is that we need to think institutions must see themselves as cultural texts. And what do I mean by that? Which means aligning student values to organizational structures, right? So cultural texts provide new information. Currently, if we think about our cultural texts in the classroom, and we envision the typical traditional classroom, what does this say about our culture? So, you walk into the classroom, you have all desks, they're lined in a row, very neatly, facing the front of the room, where there's a single instructor is meant to stand and lecture or dispense knowledge, right? So what does this image say about our current culture, and whose value does this demonstrate, right? Compared to if we think of different populations of students, right? How might we better position the classroom to accommodate their cultural values? So cultural text really takes into information and the students' information, where we begin to take all of their experiences and all of their backgrounds and their understandings and aligns them to how we're going to organize the instruction, the organizational structure, okay? So that is one way that institutions can begin to disrupt the status quo by taking in new information and new knowledge. And this is where I speak to epistemological disruption, right? How do we rethink and evaluate policies and practices to take into account how institutional knowledge is constructed as individuals engage with and within the organization? So we have to allow spaces for new knowledge to disrupt our current system. Epistemology is basically the study of knowledge and way of knowing. Knowledge is an exchange of set of individual and collective beliefs and opinions. And to disrupt this, you need to create space for listening and discussion. And so it's really, you know, the reconstruction, and I'll begin to operationalize it soon through those 3 areas of genuine care and civic consciousness and then brave leadership. But epistemological disruption is so important to the work because we have to bring in that new knowledge, and it needs to be forced, right? And we have to take into account the various experiences. Next slide. So when I was thinking about genuine care, and correct me, team, if I'm wrong, but I believe it was Duncan Andrade who said that, you know, students don't care about what you know until they know that you care. I believe it was him. But, you know, that concept was so important. And as I was thinking about an institution, how does an institution really, you know, collectively show care? And so I began to think about how to operationalize this, because I have a quantitative methods background, and everything needs to be operationalized and defined. So I was really trying to think through this a bit. It was challenging. And so I think the first thing that came to mind of genuine care, and for an institution to enact genuine care, is for everyone in the institution to have a baseline cultural competence influencing, right? A baseline understanding of what it means to have pedagogy that is culturally sensitive and aware. And that work is hard to do. That's why I'm so appreciative of Lasana's programming gap, because it gets to that. How do you create an institution, an environment where everyone has just a baseline understanding of what it means to be culturally competent and sensitive, right? And be aware. And so I won't get too much into it, because I know Lasana will talk about it, but that was the first thing I think we can do as an institution. As you're hiring faculty, as you're hiring administrators and classified professionals, really making sure that even in the interview process that that individuals are aware that they're going to need to have some education when it comes to equity and social justice, right? And how do you begin to integrate those policies? So that was the first thing, really a baseline understanding. I think a second thing that we don't do often enough is have rich opportunities for reflection and dialogue. It's just, it's business as usual, right? We keep going, we go, we sit at meetings and talk and we plan, but we don't set aside time to say, that really confused me, I'm not understanding, or you hurt my feelings, I'm not sure where you're coming from, or this student feels this way and I'm not sure why, or you have this policy in place and why are we doing it, or why is the mission statement do this but the budget doesn't line, really just critical institution reflection and dialogue, and taking the time to be to call people in and really feel safe in this environment. The last point is, really fostering the belief shared by all that the students possess brilliance and limitless potential. And this is so important. I think have gone to a community college, and I talk about the person who just really changed my life. He believed in me. And I think at times we say we believe in students, but it doesn't come out that way through our action. And so genuine care is really making sure that everyone truly understands the brilliance of students. Next slide, please. So the second point is civic consciousness. And civic consciousness has to do with a few things, right? You think of, civic, you think of responsibilities to the citizens in like the community, or in our case, the community is the community college, right? We can measure the health of a society by how it cares for its most vulnerable citizens, right? I truly believe that. That's how we can measure what we're doing. And so that's the question we might ask, that how are we measuring and caring for our most vulnerable populations? And so, creating sustained exchanges through civic discourse and professional engagement to bring understanding and awareness of oneself and the reality of others, Lisa Delpit talks about others people's children, right? What is the reality about caring about other people's children or students? And so civic consciousness it becomes outside of the individual, but becomes more of a collective approach in caring about others. And so I feel that civic consciousness is one way for us to begin to really disrupt the status quo. Also, the beliefs and values about the common good. You know, the common good has been used a lot in political, as was used in the Great Depression to really bring about, you know, collective action and change. But it was more for, you know, white males, you know, when it came to it, it's not really about folks of color. And so the common good, if we put it into a practice of really being disrupting the status quo, you know, we need to foster a responsive campus community that holds all of its members accountable for the well-being of others. And I think that's so important to civic consciousness. You know, do you care about this population of students? Do you care about how these folks are struggling? You know, how do we help everyone in the community college and in your campus become accountable for the well-being of others? I was on a call and I think someone says, I will know when change has happened, when this person cares about my children, right? I think there's something true to that. And so civic consciousness really speaks to not only the common good, but our rights as citizens to go outside of ourselves and begin to ask, how is this individual dealing with this situation or whatnot? Next slide. And then brave leadership is the last component of the obligation gap. Brave leadership really names disparities and shares accountability, right? This has to do with just having the research and having real talk, what I would call real talk as an institution to identify those populations that are struggling. And then how, as a collective team, do you share in that accountability to ensure that, that we're meeting the needs of those students? Another thing that's huge is promoting an equity agenda in administrator, staff, and faculty hiring and evaluation. That's so important. You know, who are we hiring? You know, one question I like to ask in the interviews when it comes to the finalists is, you know, why do you think poverty exists, right? If you ask someone why they think poverty exists, you might be able to get to a lot of sort of assumptions and beliefs that they might have. And so I think that's very important as we're moving forward as leaders, that the mission, the agenda needs to really be seen in both the hiring and evaluation process. Third point is implementing a mission and purpose designed to inspire change in others, right? How do we begin to take a look at our not only institutional documents, but as we are leaders looking at the purpose and the goals to making sure that they're inspiring transformational change and not just, you know, sort of going on the day by day. You know, I have this nice little mission statement that speaks to all of these planned objectives and, you know, just getting real and throwing all of that out. You know, if we're going to have a call to action, we need a call to action to really do the work. And so I think the time is now, enough is enough, and we have to be willing to have these tough conversations. And then I think the last point that really bugs me the most is understanding really the cost of silence. It is a cost to be silent. You know, there have been so many times where I've been in rooms where people say, oh, that's just how that person is. We'll wait for them to retire. You know, or, oh, that's just how that program is or that department. We'll just, you know, that's okay. We'll just put them to the side, you know, and if we don't point it out, you know, if we don't talk about, you know, the psychological trauma that comes with sort of, you know, the systemic racism, if we don't call out what we see, if we're afraid to, we are just repeating, you know, 400 years, you know, of oppression and then not having any moments for liberation. So I think understanding the psychological cost is really important. Next slide. So I want to leave you on this quote, you know, through epistemological disruption, brave leadership, civic consciousness inspired by genuine acts of care, institutional leadership embrace new ways of knowing, thinking, and being. And that's what it's really about, minding the obligation gap. You know, how do we create new language, new principles, new ideas, new assumptions to really bring around transformational change? this book for me was just, was just a moment of, it just helps liberate me and just helps with just me understanding even my own obligation and how I want to be in this work, being my authentic self. So I thank you so much. I look forward to you all reading the book and providing comments to me just about the chapter and beyond. And at this time, I'll turn it back over to Dr. Harris if he's able, or Lasana. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Taylor Mendoza. So we're at the point of the webinar where we are going to invite all of the attendees to engage in some dialogue with our panelists, with our authors, I should say. And there's a couple options that you have to do that. You can use the webinar chat, which it looks like most of you have been making good use of throughout the webinar. There's also the Q&A option on at the bottom of your screen. So with the Q&A option, that gives panelists the opportunity to answer questions out loud or to actually type responses to your questions as well. And so what I think I'd like to do, there's been a question, a very good question actually, that's been posed already in the chat window by Tim Gracie. And I want to start with this question, open it up to the panelists. We could have maybe 2 responses at most to each question before we move to the next one. But here's the question. How do you recommend addressing the seemingly conflict between the concept of brave leadership to name disparities with the apparent need to be resolute and supportive of the institution during a crisis like our current global pandemic? And there's a follow-up question to this one as well, but I think that's probably a good one where we can start with. How do we do the things we need to do in terms of, being brave, equity-minded leaders while also maintaining, some commitment and some obligation to the institution, particularly understanding that our institutions are incredibly vulnerable right now because of the global pandemic. So who would like to address that one?
I'm always ready to go, but I can open it up if anybody else wants to address it.
Dr. Sims, why don't you start, and then we could also invite follow-ups to your response.
Sure, because I think Lasana is reconnecting now. Lasana, did you hear the question?
No, I just got on.
Okay,
I just
Frank,
got back.
can you repeat that question? Because I was actually thinking this is a Lasana question. So.
Okay, so Lasana, you get the first crack at this question.
Wow. Yeah, go ahead and hit me. And then
all right, here you go.
Kind of stuff.
All right.
You got it.
How do you recommend addressing the conflict between brave leadership and having to name disparities with the need to also be resolute and supportive of the institution during a crisis like the global pandemic?
Okay. Yeah, so my thing is, in my work, I have always been a supporter and an advocate for the students. And so what I connect all of the decisions that I, hope to engage in and support and to have impact and influence over is, let's ask this question about how does this play out in the efforts of student success? So when we contextualize about our experiences around particular agendas or particular circumstances, it can be an either or, right? We can go back and forth. But when we start from the question that one of my mentors early in the field, Bob Sosa, said, ask yourself, what impact does this have on students and how does this contribute to student success? And so I don't think that we'll be able to find any type of disruption, whether it's the current COVID-19 crisis that we're in or the economic downturn that we are in the midst of, or anything that will say, well, that's going to override any works that we're doing to work with the most vulnerable populations, because we have to have a work, because we're open access public institutions, we have to have a work that directly focuses our efforts on those communities that are most vulnerable. And I still haven't been able to see how equity work and social justice work does not connect to that. And and then also it's a challenge that we have when people make these mutually exclusive kind of statements, like, how can you be more inclusive without compromising excellence? Who said that inclusivity compromises excellence? How can you have a culturally relevant pedagogy while maintaining rigor? Who said culturally relevant wasn't rigorous, right? And so how can you maintain addressing the disruption while still having an equity advancing? They're not mutually exclusive. They're actually parallel.
Thank you, Lasana. I do want to invite maybe one other panelist if they'd like to extend Lasana's remarks. Tabitha, was that a hand? Okay, go for it.
I just want to continue with what Lasana was saying. I think for me, when the question asks for the concept of brave leadership, how do we hold together, right? Name disparities, understanding that we're in a crisis and our institutions need our support. I think, to reiterate what Lasana is saying, those two are not mutually exclusive. We can do both, and we need to do both. We need to hold our institutions accountable. We are obligated to serve these students well, and we have not been. And if we are able to discount equity efforts because of a pandemic or anything else that comes around, then it's not important to us, right? As people, we do not discard things that we care about, that are important to us because something gets tough. And that goes with our institutions when we are talking about our students. Because we have other things going on does not negate the fact that we need to be focused on serving our students. We need to make our colleges student ready, and we need to do that internal work. It is our obligation. So I think you can do both. I think you can support your institution as they are trying to readjust to this remote learning in many cases, while still pushing forward and ensuring that our students are being serviced. Because let's be clear, our students who are not being served well now that we have transitioned to remote because of COVID-19 were the same students who had not been being served previously. It is not a different group of students. Our students are in need.
Thank you, Tabitha. I think your remarks in some ways are aligned with something I heard Chancellor Oakley say on one of the recent webinars in responding to budget crisis and COVID-19 and how these things are going to impact support for students. And one thing that he said that really resonated with me was that now is not the time that we divest in equity. This is a time where we need to be even more invested for the reasons that you've articulated, is that the students who are most hurt by the pandemic, the students who are most hurt and most vulnerable to the effects of an economic downturn are the same students who we were really trying to work. We were focused on, our equity efforts were focused on in terms of closing, obligation gaps, I should say. And so I think your remarks and some of the things that you shared are aligned with that perspective.
Let me add one more thing,
yeah,
Frank. One more thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
If we really didn't have a handle on providing equity advancing or equity-minded or culturally relevant pedagogy before the crisis, just slapping it online is only going to exacerbate it. And so this is actually, for those of us who want to be brave leaderships, this is a perfect time to be disruptive because we're in this huge moment of opportunity. And so in this huge moment of opportunity, it's not going to do any good to have culturally irrelevant pedagogy that was in face-to-face go ahead and carry itself out in the virtual space. So what we need to do is take the advantage of the fact that we're going to a virtual space and say that we need to be more prepared and we need to have professional development better, right? So that we can take advantage of this huge opportunity where professional development is more accessible, where the conversation is more accessible, and where the technology is more accessible. But taking traditional frameworks and putting them online, you just have a digital version of getting the same outcomes.
Yeah. Thank you. How about we move to the next question? This one comes from Chris Chavez. And then, you know, maybe we'll give Jeremiah, Jennifer, or Jeremy, you know, the first opportunity to answer this one. But for the California community system, what is the best way to address the obligation gap through the implementation of guided pathways? And for some reason, I think this is this question for me screams Jennifer Taylor Mendoza. So I feel like she should have the first attempt at it.
Thank you. And my video's off. I'm having technical challenges as well. So, but I have my audio. I think for me, the best way is just to start the dialogue, right? And have those conversations about, you know, who in the guided pathway is not being successful. So I think, you know, the dialogue is so important, and creating an environment, an inclusive environment where you're calling people in and not calling people out is super important. You know, Brave Leadership, you know, names the disparities. It discusses the populations who are struggling, who have not been successful. And so guided pathways, if you're going to, before you jump to not only taking a look at, you know, the curriculum and how long it takes the students to get through a pathway and things of that nature, and how courses are not aligned or whatever, and things take 2 years and compared to 1 year, I think you need to talk about who's not even making it through, right? And so for me, I think that dialogue and that intentional examination and reflection of the practices and things that we're doing in the system is really crucial. And so I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. For Jeremiah, you want to add to that?
I just had a quick thing to add, because with guided pathways, it's interesting. It's an interesting prospect for me, because we've seen guided pathways before. Right? It's called tracking when you don't do it correctly, right? And it is prevalent in K-12 education. So if it's not done well, then all you do is replicate a system that has continuously and continually pathologized and penalized students of color, simply by virtue of the families that they're born into and the color of their skin. And so I think that with guided pathways, there has to be a concerted effort before the pathways are even identified, of what type of safeguards are going to be in place, so that a system that is inherently and intrinsically and almost intractably problematic, like tracking, isn't just replicated in a community college space. And so I don't have the answer to that, but what I would suggest is that people pay close attention to the way that they're constructing their pathways and the information around the pathways to make sure that those safeguards are in place. Because if you just replicate tracking, a lot of the students that we serve that come from underserved communities and underserved schools, they've already experienced some of those things. And so if you replicate that at the community college level, there's no freedom, there's no liberation. All you're doing is further convincing them that that is what education looks like. And so I think that we need to be really, really careful on how we conceptualize and roll out guided pathways. I will say that. I know that doesn't answer the question directly, but that was just a warning that I wanted to offer.
No, that's perfect. And as a follow-up, Dr. Sims, as an equity director, how do you make sure that your college is centering equity in its implementation of guided pathways? What's one or two things that we really need to make sure is happening if we want to make sure equity is central? Because, you know, the fact is the state is heavily invested in guided pathways, regardless of how we feel about it. And so I think what we have an obligation to do is to make sure that equity is not an afterthought in it. So how do we do that?
So it's a longitudinal process. You know that, Doc. There is no silver bullet, but we've been having conversations at the College of San Mateo for a long time about what equity looks like. And we have a long way to go. We're not there yet. But one of the easiest, kind of most pragmatic things that I could do was be part of the conversations and join the committee for guided pathways, so that there's always a voice in the room. We also have done some things, and Tabitha will speak to this when she covers the chapter. There are people who are on the Guided Pathways team who have gone through E3T2S. E3T2S was an acting educational equity trainer series. It's not a be-all, end-all, but it was a place for folks, cross-representational group of campus folks, to get together and have conversations around what equity looks like. Not just conversations, but we also dig into extant literature around equity, present on it, have conversations. We do homework. We did all these things to try to create and even curate a space where equity is at the forefront of the conversations that we have about guided pathways, as well as the other initiatives that we need to wrestle with on our campuses. Because what has been happening is that if people can do the work that they normally do and sprinkle a little equity on it, then generally folks are okay in my experience. But what we're trying to help them understand, even if you teach math, social justice and equity should be the vehicle in which the math content is delivered, not the other way around. So that works with guided pathways or whatever else. So what we're working on, and Tabitha and I work very closely on this, is trying to catalyze a paradigm shift in the way that we think about not just the importance, because you'd be hard pressed to find folks that say equity is not important, at least out loud, but also the place of equity. And we feel like it should be a vehicle in which we deliver guided pathways, not guided pathways with a little equity. Let's figure out how to deliver equity through guided pathways. And so to talk about those types of kind of paradigmatic shifts, right now we're at the stage where we're having those conversations, but I can say that what's going on our campus, we are seeing those conversations forefronted in the ways that folks are thinking about guided pathways.
Thank you, Dr. Sims. This next question is for Professor Wallace, because it's about faculty engagement and buy-in. And it says, and I apologize, I forget who asked the question, so I'll make sure I acknowledge them, but let me ask it first. In the community college system, equity is still optional. Faculty do not have to participate, nor are they held accountable to metrics to demonstrate cultural competency or the ability to teach in their evaluations. How do we disrupt systems put in place to protect and serve? And protect and serve is in quotes, by the way.
Yes, sir. Right. Yeah, I appreciate that question. Yeah, definitely speaks to the heart of my two chapters. I think kind of back to Dr. Taylor Mendoza's point, is like you got to start with the people, right? And equity, at least in our district, has been very grassroots, right? It's the folks who are committed to this movement and to justice that start these conversations, they start these task groups or committees, and eventually they're able to grow that group of educators, right? I think, from my perspective, I think the most effective way to actually promote meaningful change is for the leadership of the campuses to work together, right? It's if you have an administration or a senate or a union that is not interested in equity work, it's not impossible, it becomes exponentially harder, right? Because you're really, if you're a small group of faculty interested in justice, but the folks that hold the power within the institution are not interested, it becomes a much longer fight, right? You almost have to infiltrate those power structures at some point. But if you can get the Senate and the administration working, and I think that's what the original participant had possibly suggested, was that the faculty and the faculty leadership and the administration is ready to tackle this. Like, what do we do now? And I say, get to work, right? Get to work on dismantling those policies and those practices and those structures that promote inequity. Start educating your peers, bring them into, call them in, as Dr. Taylor Mendoza said, get them involved, and then eventually people are going to start gravitating towards that group, right? I think Skyline's a good case model on how that happened, right? It started small and people started gravitating toward this group of educators who are trying to make these changes, right? And by educators, I mean faculty, staff, administration, right? And the protect and serve, and so I think the protect and serve is the trickier part. I mentioned this in the discussion, but there needs to be more research and publications on collective bargaining agencies, right? Because I think this is where it gets a little sticky, right? It becomes really hard to require faculty to engage in equity, right? Whether that's through a training program, through the curriculum process. Let me that's a whole. I'll talk about curriculum process in my webinar. Right, that's actually one of the probably the easiest ways to get this started. But I think the faculty leadership needs to engage the union to make sure that the faculty evaluation procedures are promoting equity and justice in the classroom and in the pedagogies, and in what we do when faculty fall short of their duties to our students, right? And so I know that's kind of like a very high level, probably pretty vague answer. But I think the bottom line is that if you're interested in equity and you know that your colleagues, whether they're administrators, faculty, or staff, are also interested in equity, start working, right? Eventually people are gonna join you, and you're gonna start to build that capacity, and definitely start infiltrating your leadership groups, right? If your academic senate's not on board with equity, get your butt on the academic senate, right? And get your colleagues who are interested in equity on academic senate, right? And start building that capacity to make changes at that level.
Thank you, Jeremy. And that question came from Danita Scott. Quick follow-up, Jeremy. I'm wondering if you can answer this follow-up question in 30 seconds or so. It comes from Ileana De Silva, who's asked a similar question. How do we? So our faculty ranks are being, more often than not, filled with part-time and adjunct faculty. So how do we get them on board and also hold them accountable for the same things?
Right, yeah.
The question. Yeah,
that's a great question. Yeah, great question. Well, I think there's a few ways that you could do this. I think that the best way is to work with the administration to bring these adjuncts in. I definitely would want to make sure that any adjunct faculty member who's interested in improving their teaching or who want to be involved in equity work should be compensated for that work. And so if you have an administration that is ready to really work on equity, they should be putting their wallet where their mouth is, right? And start paying these adjuncts to be involved in this work. If compensation is not an option, I think, there's the Enacting Equity training series that CSM put together is a good option. And you can possibly bring in the adjuncts in kind of in a way that they would feel comfortable working with equity-minded colleagues on their teaching, maybe on like a one-on-one basis or small group basis, in a way that's not going to overburden them. Because again, like with adjuncts, it comes down to the pay. We got to make sure that they're getting paid for this work. And then as far as like any adjuncts that are resistant, it's the same answer as if you have full-timers that are resistant, right? We need to revamp and revise our evaluation procedures, right? And our requirements for employment, right? We need orientations that are required of all new hires, whether adjunct or full-time, that are built on the foundation of anti-racism, right? And equity and justice, right? So I think that's just a couple ideas that kind of came up.
Yeah. And then there's a request in the chat that's asking for information about the equity training series that's been referenced a couple times. So maybe someone can just put a link or some source of information in the chat. Okay. This next question, I'll open this up to the entire group. Comes from Jennifer Lawson. If the first pillar of guided pathways is entering the path, how do we best reach out to students who may not have access to technology? I understand that we're in the midst of the pandemic and remote teaching is required, but doesn't this perpetuate inequity? Any takers on that one?
All right, talking to myself. So yes, the quick answer is yes, it perpetuates inequity. But we've seen this for a long time, and particularly in STEM-focused education, right? So the idea for a long time with regard to computer science education, coding, you just give a bunch of poor kids iPads, that fixes inequity, right? Without addressing larger pragmatic needs around access to networks and all those types of things. And so I wish I had an answer offer you. But I just wanted to speak to the first part of the question, to the heart of the question. It actually absolutely represents, presents, and exacerbates current inequities. But I don't know. I mean, I'm open to whoever has an explanation. Some of the things that we've tried to do on our campus in light of this is to provide hotspots, right? To provide computers that are loaned. So let's fix some of the pragmatic considerations. But I was sharing with someone earlier on the thread. You know, I have five sons, little guys, amazing little guys, and my nephew used to live with me. So there was 6 young men in the house, and so he came to us from Stockton, California. You know, if you know Stockton every year is one of the, supposedly, I haven't spent much time there, least desirable places to live for a number of reasons. And he came from a particularly rough part of Stockton. And I'm not bashing Stockton. I don't know. This is what I read. He came from a particularly rough part of Stockton. And so he wasn't overly concerned with what was going on outside. His mom kept him inside because he's a big guy. He's 6'6", 240 pounds. So he couldn't go outside. Nobody's going to fight him. And so when you're in a community where those types of things are going on, you need to be protected. So he stayed in the house a lot. He was a good student. He tried to do his homework. And he told me something that never even occurred to me. Even though I grew up like this, I wasn't in school at the time. He said it was hard for him to do his homework there, not because of what was going on outside, but because he was so tall and his mattress was on the floor. He didn't have a support system underneath his mattress. He didn't have right? So it was just a mattress and it was on the floor. So he said every time he would sit down to do his homework, he'd find himself laying down, and before long, he'd fallen asleep. And so those types of considerations, like even if you give a student, so that particular student, let's take him for an example, we give him a computer, we give him access to Wi-Fi, there's still additional considerations that need to be met. And so if we're interested in justice, then we need to hear from students. So the first step is to hear from students. A lot of times in this work, we foist our sensibilities on students and we tell them kind of what they need to be successful. And sometimes those things hold true and sometimes they don't. So we never want to speak for our students. We want to work alongside them. And this is not going to directly answer the question because admittedly, I don't have that answer. But I know that there are attendant issues that we have to pay attention to that are larger than what we've been thinking about up until this point. Just providing computers and Wi-Fi is not enough. What about a place where students can study, right? What about, there's any number of things that we can do to create opportunities to, for students to be in a better position to do their best work. Hunger is a big issue. Homelessness is a big issue. All these are issues for students that are poor, ethno-racially minoritized students of color. So there's a lot to consider, but I think that we just have to start thinking, outside of the confines of that we've been thinking about up until this point.
Thank you, Dr. Sims. It's amazing how fast these discussions go. I can't believe we're at the end of our webinar. And so, as you all know, there's going to be more opportunities to engage the panelists over the next several weeks. So, make sure you stay tuned for that. Make sure you get the book. But what I like to do also is invite the panelists to offer, a 1-minute final takeaway before we close out. And I'm going to ask Dr. Taylor Mendoza to start, and then we'll go with Tabitha, Jeremy, Lasana, and then we'll have Jeremiah close us out in that order.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. Hopefully everybody can hear and see me now. I think for me, the biggest takeaway is that I would like others to take away is that we just need to own up to the obligation to ensure that students are successful and all students are successful. So it's really simple for me, right? Just own up to it, accept the obligation, accept the responsibility that we have to do better. I always reference my 85-year-old grandmother. My family's from Mississippi, Memphis, Tennessee, Virginia. And she's always said to the grandchildren, when you know better, you do better, right? It's just as simple as that. When you know better, you do better. We know we need to do better. And so time is now. And please just accept that obligation and let's do this work together. Thank you.
Thank you. Dean Conaway.
Thank you. I think my closing remarks are really short. As we've learned from Dr. Taylor Mendoza today, there's no liminal spaces. And wherever you are, if you are staff, if you are faculty, if you are an administrator, there's no neutrality in your actions. And so we verbally say that we are anti-racist, that is our goal, but unless we critically interrogate our practices, that's not the case. So.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tabitha. All right, Jeremy.
Yeah, thank you. I think my big takeaway would be that, you know, the structures and processes exist for us to really promote equity and achieve social justice. Like, they're there, right? It's just incumbent upon us as leaders to use those processes to start to dismantle racism and white supremacy within our colleges, right? And that's why I think shared governance is such a powerful way for us to do so, right? And so we have the power, right? As Spider-Man says, great power, actually it's Spider-Man's uncle, I should say. With great power comes great responsibility. So we got to use that power responsibly to start promoting justice. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay,
So-
Dr. Sims.
So I just want to be very clear. It's something that we say, don't get it twisted, right? So if we go back, because a lot of when COVID-19 started, everyone was talking about the new normal, right? Well, and then and what was kind of being invoked by that is a kind of pining for the normalcy that we had prior to COVID-19. But what I want to say is that the normal that we had prior to COVID-19 was still whack. It was still terrible for poor ethno-racially minoritized students of color. If we had the infinity gauntlet and we could snap our fingers like Thanos, right? And we went back to prior to COVID, it was still bad. Our students were still struggling. The students that we are investing in this equity work to positively impact their educational trajectories, it was still awful, right? And it only got exacerbated and highlighted because of COVID-19. And with everything that's going on with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, this stuff is not new in my community. And so I just want to be clear that we can be impelled and compelled and carried by what's going on globally right now, but we can't lose sight of the work because this is not new. This has been going on. And so we need to continue to work even if we're not seeing the same things on the news, even if the kind of spirit that's carrying the protest begins to wane. If you are truly committed to equity and you love justice, no matter what's going on, you're going to commit to work that tears down, first highlights and calls out, and eventually tears down the structures that continually penalize poor ethno-racially minoritized students of color because of their perceived distance from whiteness. So we gotta work. We gotta roll up our sleeves and we gotta work. And that's what those are my parting words.
All right, thank you, Jeremiah. Lasana, take us home.
So based on the conversation that was led by Dr. Taylor Mendoza today, and the reason why the summer series is structured this way, is that we cannot have an ahistorical foundation. A lot of us want to act in the moment and do the thing that's right in front of us, whether it's guided pathways or talk about what's happening in the Black Lives Matters moment, or police brutality or anything. And we want to talk about it outside of a historical context. And that's one of the reasons why we can't solve the problems, because there's a lineage of how we got here. You know, Dr. Taylor Mendoza talked about the eugenics movement. A lot of people kind of talk about that anecdotally and kind of marginally, but when the people who actually created the assessment tools that we use to assess intellect literally subscribed and promoted and developed instruments to delineate human groups, right, based on intellect, that's major. But most of us who are in education are rarely exposed to that. So the takeaway from today is to mind the obligation gap, as Dr. Taylor Mendoza said. We have to have some sort of historical frames of reference. So when you get access to the book, whether it's the ebook and when the paperback becomes available, you have to start in that chapter so that you can understand what we're dealing with overall. Why were the structures created? In the way in which the structure was created speaks to the kind of outcomes we have now, right? And so the thing to take away is to understanding exactly what she said. We're getting the exact results that were designed by public education, because public education was not designed with the students who populate our colleges in mind. And that's the takeaway. And what do we have to know? And how do we have to prepare ourselves to disrupt those structures? But how are you going to disrupt something and you don't even know how it got that way? So, Jeremy, you got me on the slide deck? So we're going to conclude with a couple of things. One, this book is part of a series, okay? Myself and Dr. Sims have been able to build a relationship with Peter Lang Publisher. And the series centers theory and practice enacting educational equity and ultimately educational justice at administrative, institutional, governance, and pedagogical levels of community colleges. I'm not going to read it verbatim, but I want to tell you this. Myself and Jeremiah and a lot of our colleagues, and especially the co-authors of this book, have been having conversations about the great work that's being done by SEAL and Q and Race and Equity and RP Group and C3SN and all these other wonderful colleagues. But what we have said was we want to contribute alongside and in concert with our colleagues at the four-year institutions and at the community-based organizations. And we want to have community college instructors, community college administrators, community college classified professionals also contribute to the literature. And so this series is about how you can contribute to the literature, right? This series is about how our voices are coming forward. So this happens to be a collective of practitioners from the San Mateo Community College District, but this series is the opportunity to open it up beyond that. And so we want to give you an opportunity to understand that. And if you have any ideas about books or things that should come from the community college voice, feel free to email Dr. Jeremiah Sims, who's put his email address inside the chat box. The next thing I want to say is that our next webinar will be next Thursday. It should be Thursday. Is it Tuesday or Thursday? It's Tuesday. It's Tuesday. Tuesday is the 16th. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's Tuesday, right? Next Tuesday, the 16th.
Let me look it up. Sorry, I might mess that up.
And our host will be Frank's co-director of SEAL, which will be J. Luke Wood. And so we are encouraging you all to register and to join us. You can join us even if you don't register, but the thing about registering is if we're going to send out any follow-up information as far as an assessment or the link to this particular recording and things of that nature, we can just hit a button and reply to you versus those who have signed on without being registered. And
it is Tuesday, by the way.
That date's correct, right?
Yeah, it's correct, yep.
Okay, so next Tuesday. So lastly, I would like to let everyone know that you can get your book at a discounted rate if you send an email to peterlang@presswarehouse.com. And if you use the promo code MOG620, it gives you a 30% discount. So what I would like to say before I hand it over to, I think I think Frank is still here. Frank, you still here?
Still here.
Okay. I'm just going to say something. I'm going to let Frank just totally close it out. We really appreciate you all some 300 of you all who joined us this afternoon for this conversation. And we know that this conversation isn't the end all, the be all, and we won't have the precise exact answers to all of your questions. But what we will give you is point you in the direction of the scholarship, point you in the direction of the case studies, point you in the direction of the frameworks that will allow you to be able to engage your institution to become more equity advancing. And with that, I hand the floor over to our colleague, Dr. Frank Harris.
Thank you, Lasana. And please join me in offering a virtual applause to our 5 panelists, our 5 authors who did an amazing job. Of course, go out and get the book. And in closing, I'd like to offer this, a quote that resonates with a theme that's come up several times throughout our discussion today. It's every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results that it gets. So if we want to change the results, we have to change the system. So with that, I thank you all and look forward to seeing you all again soon, be it virtually or eventually in person. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Harris. Bye, everybody.